Today, I want to talk about population change and sustainable development and the notion of the demographic dividend, which we'll talk more about what that means specifically. But the reason we need to look at this, especially for Africa, is the projected population growth. So the population growth is increasing rapidly, and so we need to be able to plan for that and think about how the segments of different ages will change over time. Currently, Uganda is about 78% of Ugandans are under the age of 30. It's one of the youngest countries on the planet. And then 80% of Ugandans live in the rural area. So only about 20% of Ugandans live in urban areas. And the prediction is that over time, people will migrate from the rural area into more urban centers as the urban centers develop. So the idea is to be able to think about these things and influence the political will to plan for some of these dynamics in terms of policies and funding. So the reason we are so concerned, especially on the African continent, with this idea of population growth is that as you're looking at this chart of the top 20 most fertile countries, 18 of them are in Africa. So if you can see, Uganda here dropped out of the top 5, but for a long time it was one of the top 5 most fertile countries in the world. So we've brought down the fertility rate a bit, having to do with better planning around reproductive health and family planning. And so what we want to think about in terms of this demographic dividend is being able to maximize the potential economic benefit of this working age adult. So the way you do that is to drop the fertility rate, right? You decrease the fertility rate, you decrease mortality, infant and maternal mortality, and then you would have more people in the working age segment than in the dependent segment or the elderly segment. So that the idea is the households will be smaller, and so they will have more income with fewer people. So that would increase the economic prosperity of the country. So you look at the prediction in terms of the global prediction of how many Africans will be on the planet, and we see that by 2050, 24% of the population in the world will be African, and then by 2100 we're looking about 1 in every 3 people will be African. So they're doing different high, middle, low predictions. But most predictions go around that Asia is currently the most populous part of the planet now, but as we're moving forward, Africa will take that place of being the most populous place on the planet. And so being able to think about these things and plan for the population. So the time that a country reaches replacement is 2 children, right? So if you are a couple, usually they talk about a man and a woman, but if you are a couple in a household with 2 children, you are what's considered at a replacement rate of reproduction, right? So you're 2 people, you have 2 children, they're going to replace you. So in the developed world now, most of the countries have fallen below replacement. So United States is at about 1.7, 1.8. fertility rate, which is below replacement, and there's places such as like Korea and Japan and the Nordic countries who are well below that. They're looking at like 1.4, 1.3. And so then that becomes problematic if you're falling way below replacement, then you have an issue of workforce. So you end up having a country that's top heavy, um, which is what's happening in the United States as the baby boomers start to become the elderly population. We're seeing more of a top-heavy population in terms of people being in their later or senior years. Most of the population being in their later or their senior years. So the plan is to have an idea of when you'll reach replacement, because that will predict your future population of that country. Because obviously, unless you have a great deal of immigration into the country, once you reach replacement, that's pretty much where the total population will remain around, unless there's some catastrophic disease, or it usually has not been the case that there's a reverse in population. So once fertility starts to decline, it will continue to decline until it stabilizes at a certain point. We haven't really seen much of going the other way, although many countries, having seen this falling below replacement rates, have started to put in policies to encourage people to have more children, tax benefits and longer leaves and leaves with pay. So we see some countries trying to work on having enough of that working population. But also, some countries will look to other countries where they have a higher rate of fertility to try and recruit some people to immigrate to those countries. It happens quite a bit here in terms of countries wanting people to learn their language and be educated there, and then eventually live there. So there's a lot of immigration that's attracted through education mainly. So we look at this one in Rwanda, and this is also, they're looking at predicting when they will start, when they would hit replacement. So you can see here, this is the predicted population if they hit about 32 million, if they hit replacement in around 2056, something like that. And this one is for Tanzania. And if we look at this one and say they hit replacement in 2040, their population would be around 120 million. And you can look at Uganda here, and we see that if they were to hit replacement in 2080, the population would be around 250 million. If they were to hit it sooner, in 2060, it would be around 170 million. So we look at some of the things that we need to really focus on in order to have that decline in fertility, so that we can realize this demographic dividend. Because if the fertility rate continues to be high, you're not going to have that population of working age that is more than the dependent. We'll look at the age structure pyramids a little bit later. But this is looking at the total number of unmet need for women in terms of birth control, and then the percentage. So if we look at East Africa, is here in red. They're talking about 20 million women who want to use birth control but don't have access for one reason or another. And then if you look at the percentage, it's about 54% of women. Um, and if we look at South Africa, it's about 53 million, and about 60% of um, of women have unmet family planning needs. But another thing I wanted to point out about this is sometimes we need to maybe look more at the mindset and social changes. I think most of reproductive health tends to look at the actual practical, can you get birth control? Can you afford birth control? Is it the right kind for your lifestyle and that kind of thing? But part of what I looked at in my dissertation is that sense of the the self-determining factor, the mindset or the social norms around reproduction. So in Uganda, there's pretty intense pressure to produce on women, on families, and I think if that attitude doesn't shift, it doesn't really matter much if you are able to provide the practicals of getting women birth control, if in their minds they feel they have to produce so many children. There's actually a fear of birth control because, God forbid, you are unable to produce it all. That's a huge catastrophe in a woman's life in Uganda. So I think over time, as we maybe start to look at global trends and women are exposed to different worldviews, some of that may change. But as it is now, the number one thing Ugandan society wants a woman to do is to produce children. So they don't want to hear about your PhD or your work. The first question they're going to ask you is how many children you have. If you say two, they want to know when are you having more, why haven't you had more. So there's a lot of intense social pressure to produce children. And so we looking at some of this, and they tend to break this out into married women versus unmarried women. I think they just need to look at women in general, um, and perhaps stop stigmatizing it even within the way we report things. Um, but if you look at Uganda, they're saying that 17.9% of married women are using some form of contraceptive, and 40% of women are currently not use of married women are currently not using any form of contraceptive. And if you look at our neighbor Kenya, they have a much higher percentage of women using contraceptives, and as a result, they have a much lower fertility rate than we do in Uganda. And you see, Rwanda as well has a high percentage of married women currently using birth control. And so we look at this structure, this population age structure, and we see a larger base here in 1950, 2010. We still have a larger, we're above replacement. So we're going to have a larger base here in terms of the younger dependent population. So the demographic dividend starts to happen as you reduce the number of children that you're having. And then you also reduce the infant and maternal mortality so that you're having less children, they're staying alive, and they're getting into their working years. So this is where you would start seeing that demographic dividend economic benefit where you have fewer dependents and more working age adults. So if you compare Kenya to Thailand, and the East Asian countries have had success in terms of realizing this demographic dividend by reducing fertility and reducing maternal and infant mortality. So they're comparing those two countries. And Tunisia is one African country that has seen remarkable fertility decline. So if we compare Tunisia to Ethiopia, we can see how Tunisia has already started realizing that demographic dividend. So we start looking at here at Tunisia where their dependent children are less than the working age adults, right? Whereas Ethiopia, we're still seeing more dependents than working age adults. So this axis here is where you're looking at the age, and the blue is male, the yellow is female. In some instances, in some structures, you can see a difference between male and female where you have that female infanticide or male preference in some of the Asian countries where there are more males than females because of that son preference and female infanticide. But we look at some of the success stories in terms of those countries that have now experienced economic prosperity due to taking advantage of this demographic dividend by investing in some of these major areas of health, reproductive health, education, and policies that support the maximization of taking advantage of that demographic dividend. So we look at the ratio of working age to dependent population, and this chart is looking at when that will peak. So we want to know at what point will it peak. And if we look at East Asia, they're peaking now somewhere here in the 2000s. South America a little bit later in the 2020s, and then if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, this would be, based on the predictions, this would be when that ratio would peak in terms of having more working age adults than dependents. So this is another one that is looking at if it will have a less of a peak and peak later if fertility continues to decline at a slower rate. If the fertility rates continue to be high for longer periods of time, it will be a longer time and less of a boost in terms of realizing that demographic dividend. So part of the focus has to be meeting that need of reducing fertility. So we saw some like the one-child policy in China did that artificially, right? Or through policy made it so that people, they had that rapid decline in fertility. Of course, now the one-child policy later on became a problem because now they're top heavy, they're imbalanced in population because of the son preference. So perhaps that policy would be the best way to go, but you want to look at ways to motivate people to reduce fertility in a more practical and quickly and in a shorter period of time. So it helps to be able to reduce the fertility and reduce the infant and maternal mortality. But we also need to think about productive employment for that working age group. So it doesn't help us for people to reach that working age group and not have work to do. So currently, we're in that situation in Uganda. We have a high youth unemployment. We have a high unemployment rate, but particularly high in the youthful under 30 population. So the other day we were talking about how they had turned off the internet. So am I against that? Partly, I think it's helpful because you have to think that a significant portion of Ugandans are literally teenagers. So they have a lot of time on their hands. And so those kind of political things can easily excite a population to, protest in ways that are destructive. And so sometimes those things, although they seem very undemocratic and dictatorial, where we are now in terms of our politics and our population, they can be helpful to prevent, fatalities and violence, and people getting hurt, loss of property due to those protests. Um, and so we think about that. What happens when we are able to reduce that population, and people will have more money in smaller households, and so that will lead to the growth in purchasing power because they have higher incomes and have less dependence to spend that on. And so essentially what the population wants to get to is a comfortable replacement rate, right? The children that you have, they stay alive and you're able to stay around that replacement rate. And we want to look at particularly education. The age and education of a female has a significant impact on maternal and infant mortality. So that's an area that you want to focus on, and you want to um, focus on educating the girl child up through secondary, at least, and into tertiary, and have people have access to that family planning, but also working on social norms and shifting that idea that people have in terms of how many children they want to have. So women are already in the workforce. But they're looking at informal ways of making money. They sell food or they sell some small vegetables. But we want to be able to have women participate in the formal sector where they're able to make more of an income, so they would have to be educated at a higher rate so they can have more opportunities in that formal sector. And then we're looking at these are countries where they have higher unmet need, right? So they have more women are looking to access family planning than are actually able to access family planning. But even in the countries where we have a significant proportion of women able to access and use contraceptives, there's still a high unmet need. Um, so we have to be able to look at all of that in terms of planning programs and policy wise. And then some of the issues that we want to address is early marriage. So most countries in East Africa, I think actually all of the countries in East Africa have a marriage, an age of 18 as the legal marriage age. But that doesn't often mean that women are not getting married off at an earlier age. In my mother's era, it was common. My mother was married at the age of 14, and then she had me at the age of 15, and she had the four of us by the time she was 23. So that type of fertility, or that type of having children in that short period of time at a young age, leads to high infant and maternal mortality. So you want women to be getting married later and starting to have children later. In their 20s would be the ideal time, where it would help in terms of reducing infant and maternal mortality. And um, we see in East Africa about 41% of women are getting married by the age of 18. So that means many of them are getting married before the age of 18. And so then we look at the enrollment of children in secondary education. We look at East Africa, and we are seeing um, we don't have gender parity. So there are more boys than girls enrolled. About 30% to 32% of girls are enrolled in secondary school, and 39% of boys. Whereas we see in blue in this one is for girls, and the red is for boys. And we see in Southern Africa that we actually have achieved a level of gender parity for girls, and there are actually more girls than boys um, that are enrolled in secondary school. So some of these big picture things that we want to look at in terms of realizing that demographic dividend, realizing the benefit of that population structure. And so looking at policies in public health, and um, especially looking things around youth and gender and female empowerment, and thinking about how to best put our resources in the high benefit areas. And then, of course, this is an issue, I think we're seeing an issue globally, to try and reduce that gap between the rich and the poor. And so we're seeing some success. We're seeing success stories in terms of economic growth. The continent is seeing um, growth more than other parts of the globe, as there's more potential and more opportunities. Most of the developed regions have reached a place where the growth has kind of flatlined, and so we're seeing bigger opportunities and more potential for growth on the continent. But part of that, has to be around some of the things that we're looking at in terms of developing the infrastructure and using the resources in terms of the mineral exploitation, oil and minerals and all of that is here, but we need to be able to use it consciously. So some of the challenges that we look at, as I was talking about, the high unemployment and underemployment, heavy reliance on these natural resources, which are often not managed well in terms of the income that comes from it. But it's also those resources are finite, right? And so will eventually not be available. So we need to be looking at diversifying the sectors in which we have employment, and then subsistence farming, which is how many people in Uganda and East Africa are making their living, is volatile, right? In terms of climate change, and so you have years where there's drought and causes a lot of issues. So those are developing some ways to help ameliorate some of those concerns, and better planning around the urbanization. Um, cities just kind of pop up and they're poorly planned. You have traffic and you have all kinds of issues around not well planned cities, and the issue of governance, reducing corruption. And so these are some of the big picture things that we're looking at in order to be able to, get the full benefit of this demographic dividend. Um, and then these are some of the major meetings that have been happening around this topic to start and equip people with information and plans, and have a strategy moving forward. And these are the countries of focus. If you remember the high fertility rate countries, um, those would be in here as well. You see, East Africa is um, having quite an impact in terms of looking at realizing this demographic dividend on the continent.